Hello, everyone. We're going to get started. Welcome to today's webinar. I'm Elliot Levine, Research Director at the Aurora Institute, and I'll be facilitating today's webinar. It's part of a series of more than 20 webinars we're offering this fall on important issues related to education system transformation, personalized competency-based education. We'll be putting a link to all the webinars in the chat box later. And the webinar series is a prologue to our annual Aurora Institute Symposium, which we're holding virtually this year on October 26th to 28th. So we hope you'll also join us for that. There's lots more information on our website, aurora-institute.org, and we'll be putting a link in the chat box for that later as well. Next slide, please. During today's webinar, we encourage you to use the chat box to help us get to know each other and learn from each other. And you could start by introducing yourself in the chat box if you'd like, saying who you are, where you're from, maybe a hope you have for the school year, or anything else that you'd like to share about what brings you to this webinar today. You're also welcome to share your thoughts on Twitter using hashtag Aurora2020 or our handled Aurora_INST. Today's webinar will be recorded and archived on the Aurora Institute website, and we'll be sending you a link to that in the next few days. Next slide, please. Today, we're very fortunate to have presenters from WestEd and KnowledgeWorks, two organizations with a long history of making important contributions to transforming K-12 education. We're also very fortunate to have Superintendent Craig Steinhoff of the Oaks Public Schools, and his district is part of the North Dakota Personalized Competency-Based Learning Initiative that we'll be hearing about today. Thank you to all the presenters who are joining us today, and I'm going to turn it over to Robin, who will get us started. Thanks a lot, Robin.
Good afternoon or good morning, everyone, depending on where in the world you are. I see in the chat that we have folks from Utah, Michigan, California, Florida, Arkansas, and as far away as Rwanda and Mexico. So welcome. It's fantastic to have you all here to hear about our work. You can go ahead to the next slide, Natalie. We wanted to start off by just finding out who's with us, and if you were all in the room together in San Antonio as we were scheduled to be, I would have you stand up, and we call this game That's Me. So I would say who you are and you would stand up, and we'd get to see who folks were in the room, how many researchers, how many principals, and so on. Instead, we'll do a poll, and then you can cross-reference in the chat to see who's here, and you might see that there's folks you want to connect with after the webinar. But Natalie, if you want to go ahead and put that poll up, we can see who's with us today.
Oops, 1 second.
And it might look like you can highlight, but this is just a slide, so the poll is not live yet. Just waiting for the poll to load, and then you can click on the boxes and it'll show us, I think, in a bar graph. And if it's not going to work, then we can just do what I see some folks have already done, is you can put your role in the chat there. Should we move on, Elliot?
Yeah,
here we go.
For some reason, it was telling me that polling was closed, but I'm guessing Natalie made it work.
I see it now. All right, so we see interesting split there, no funders here. but a big group of researchers, which is not surprising. So we're talking about evaluation today. And I'd love to know what the other is. I know my parents were going to join, and I told them to just fill out parent. So that they might be in the other, but I'd love to know in the chat if there are some other state agency education specialists. That makes a lot of sense. Great, okay. Go ahead and you can go to the next slide and I'll just tell you who we are. So this is our cast today. I'm Robin Higgy, I'm a Senior Program Associate at WestEd, and WestEd is the evaluator for this initiative. Natalie Lacerino-Paquette, my colleague, is the lead for the evaluation. And then we partner with KnowledgeWorks. Drake Bryan is here, and Jeff Zimmerman, and Craig Steinhoff, of course, who's the superintendent in Oaks Public Schools. And you'll meet the three gentlemen later in the presentation, and Natalie is going to help us by kind of managing the chat and letting me know if there's questions. You can go to the next slide. And there's two Natalies on here in case you are wondering. So our objectives today are pretty simple. We want to share with you what we've learned from the North Dakota Personalized Competency-Based Learning Initiative, and we call that PCBL. We are into year 2, but it's year 1 of the evaluation. And we focus a lot on continuous improvement efforts with KnowledgeWorks. So it's really been a partnership between WestEd and KnowledgeWorks rather than an evaluator swooping in to tell you what they've learned and swooping out. We've worked together with KnowledgeWorks really closely to track continuous improvement efforts. And we also, this may come up throughout the course of the webinar, obviously this work has been interrupted due to COVID. And so we are happy to share kind of how we've pivoted in that context. Go ahead, Natalie. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Jeff Zimmerman at KnowledgeWorks. He's going to do a little intro of what PCBL is, and we have another poll. So you can get that queued up pretty soon, Elliot. Over to you, Jeff.
Thanks, Robin, and hi, everyone. Do we have a short video to show at this point? Is this where we were going to show?
Yes.
Yeah, if you wouldn't mind rolling the video, it's about 3 minutes long, but I think it does a really good job of kind of capturing the essence of the work there. So this will set the foundation for the rest of our presentation.
This initiative is launching today is an opportunity for us to bring personalized competency-based education to our school districts in a very thoughtful, organized, well-supported manner.
We are often held hostage, so to speak, to the Carnegie unit and seat time when ultimately the students we serve need resiliency skills, and they need to learn how to self-advocate, and they need to know how to be ready to be successful in society beyond what's happened to them, but what they can define happens to them next.
North Dakotans are passionate for this work. We believe in our students, and we want to provide those opportunities so our students are choice ready no matter what those choices may be.
There's a greater sense in North Dakota of alignment, of policy design that inspires and empowers innovation, not just in school systems, but throughout a community.
We've been working at this for the last 3 or 4 years and recognizing the importance that it's just beyond our traditional delivery of education, that we must go deeper. To implement this system-wide, it's going to be quite a bit of communicating, it's going to be quite a bit of planning. As we get a chance to talk to many of our educators, they're ready for it. They want to provide this opportunity for our students in personalized learning.
It's an initiative that's going to bring together districts so that they can learn and grow together. Different schools across the state are going to be able to look at them and say, hey, they can do that. I want to know how they're doing that. That looks like my district, and I feel like I may be interested and may be able to take on this challenge and do this in my district.
I love that the way they have this structured is 5 years. And I mean that for lots of different reasons, but North Dakota has been progressive in lots of different areas. But if there's one thing that I hear back in my 2.5 decades of being in education, is that sometimes it feels like flavors of the month, right? That it doesn't have a sustainability factor. And so I feel that that's probably the strongest structural piece of this initiative, is that we've all committed for the long haul and even talking beyond that piece. So I feel that it'll create major change in a sustainable way because we have accountability partners.
It's realizing a dream to meet our students where they're at.
Great. So thanks, Natalie. So as Natalie's pulling up the presentation, we thought that would help kind of ground this conversation in terms of what's happening out there and put some real voices to it. In addition
our
to
students in our small rural community become successful by just really catering to who they are. And
this happened to me too. The YouTube keeps playing. So one thing I wanted to do as she brings the PowerPoint up is just grounding what we're talking about here. We're saying personalized competency-based learning a lot, and just to give you a sense of what we're talking about, the next slide kind of has the elements of PCBL, and it really mirrors the definition, the updated definition that Aurora came out with just last year. So this is what we're managing our outcomes to. So at the end of this work, these 7 sort of principles and tenets are where we're working with districts to get to. And so that is where students are empowered to make decisions, assessment is flexible and meaningful, student supports are timely, competency-based curriculum and advancing upon mastery, varied pacings and pathways, a culture of equity, and then explicit and transparent measurable learning targets. So all of those elements are what we're targeting and what we'll be measuring toward in the long run. The next slide, I want just 1 minute here to hear kind of what folks, in terms of how familiar you are with PCBL in terms of how I just described it. So just a quick poll, we'll kind of get a sense of where our audience is, and then we'll kind of move on into the meat of the discussion. Okay, so pretty much across the board. There's folks that really know it well, and then folks on the other end of the spectrum too. So we'll do a good job, hopefully, of giving an overview of the work, and then also digging deeper into where we are, because we're in year 3. We're heading into year 3 of this initiative, and so I'll do one more slide before I kind of pause and hand it over to Craig to talk a little bit more about his district. So on the next slide, you'll see an overview of this initiative. So what the video described, right? This began in 2018 in close partnership with the North Dakota Department of Public Instruction. Really worked with them to administer an RFP process across the entire state, where we sought to gauge the interest, commitment, and capacity of districts to undertake this work, this personalized competency-based learning work. Worked to ensure that it had close alignment with the existing North Dakota Choice Ready initiative and what their priorities were, so it didn't feel like it was something in addition to that. We now have 4 school districts that are going deep with to start, and hopefully this work will certainly spread. But right now we're going deep with 4, and we're about to enter year 3 of our 5-year initiative. The structure you can kind of see on the screen. We have been meeting the last 3 years, 4 times a year, where we bring folks together in district design teams. Each district has has a design team. There's a fellow, which kind of with the ed fellows go deeper, and they kind of they help drive implementation, and they support the district design team. Policy work has been happening here at the state level, and in a lot of ways has set the foundation for this work to even happen. And we have a couple partners that we're working close with, in addition to WestEd and the school districts. We're working with Ed Leader 21 on a lot of the visioning, and then the Center for Collaborative Assessment that's helping us think about the assessment work. The last thing I'll say, I want to mention, and you'll hear about this a little bit later, but we'll talk about the formative evaluation activities, and then also how the action planning efforts are driving. So each district has an action plan that are working from, that are aiming to get toward this longer term vision of PCBL. And so you'll hear and see how we're using that. So I'm gonna pause there. I'm gonna ask Natalie to do the next slide. Pause for questions or any comments. Feel free to unmute yourself, or in the chat if you have them. And if not, that's fine too. We can certainly keep going with Craig, but I'll pause for just a few seconds here.
Jeff, I wonder if we want to share the 4 districts.
Yes, yeah, I have it written down. So you'll hear from Craig with the Oaks School District. We're also working with Northern Cass, West Fargo, and then the Youth Correctional Center, the YCC. Those are our lead districts that are pioneering this work in North Dakota. So certainly you can add questions as they come in the chat. At this point, I'm going to hand it over to Craig, and he'll dive a little bit deeper into the work at Oaks. Craig?
Thanks, Jeff. Hello, everyone. I am Craig Steinert, the superintendent of the Oaks School. I am actually the 7th superintendent since 1932. So I know it's hard to believe, but Oaks has had a long history of maintaining administrators. We are a rural community in southeast North Dakota. As you can see from that map, we have a total population of 1,800 residents, and our K-12 enrollment is 500 students. We are a farm and ranch community, and just for reference, the closest Walmart to Oaks is 65 miles away and in a different state. Several years ago, North Dakota Department of Public Instruction requested schools to apply for the cohort to transition from traditional base education to PCBL. What I started with was I emailed our school board and our staff and asked them to review that email, and then at the end vote. And there was one question that said, should we as a school district consider applying to be one of the cohort members? And the vote turned out to be positive in favor of yes, we should do that. And so we then held a 3-hour meeting to review the application and to re-vote. During that time, we laughed, we cried, we screamed, and ultimately got to the point of saying that we believe that we need to do this as a district, specifically when we look at our commitments. And one of our commitments as a school district is growth mindset. And I really believe that growth mindset put us over the edge for our staff to say, if this is going to be better for our students and it's workable, we have to be doing it. We did receive some hesitation from our 7th through 12 staff when we were initially trying or voting on this. And I believe a lot of that came from the fact that they had just transitioned from a 7-period bell schedule to a flex mod schedule. And so they were in the middle of a second order change already, and we're concerned about changing, again, a second year. But our why for PCBL at Oaks is so that all of our students can reach their full potential upon graduation. We desire agency for our learners, for our staff, we desire family engagement, and we want all of our graduates to exemplify our portrait of a graduate. And so OPS strives for excellence, not perfection. So there is not a one-size-fits-all for PCBL. It needs to be personalized based on the needs of each individual district and their community, students, and staff. And last but not least, if you look at that slide, the picture up in the right is a picture of our high school. You can see the tall building. The picture in the middle is the view from the top of that building looking to the west. And then we also have a picture of the Angry Beaver Lodge, which happens to be the one and only place in town that serves dinner and also is a bar. So it's kind of the one place that people go to when they come here and need something to eat and drink after the workday is done. Next slide, please. This slide is our portrait of a graduate, and our community is deeply rooted in content. And so, as you can see from that, half of our portrait of a graduate is based on our students mastering their content, and that would be core content, math, science, English, social studies, but also other contents for electives, band, choir, career tech ed courses. And so that's the half. The other half is communication, creativity, critical thinking, and collaboration. And we believe that those are equally as important as content mastery, because we know when our students leave our doors and they go out into the world, the workforce needs that other half just as much as they need the mastery of content. And I'm going to turn it over. We're going to pause here and then turn it over to the next person, moving on to evaluation.
We did have some questions in the chat. Sorry, I was actually typing a response. And Craig, you started to answer one of the questions, which was really around sort of like, what is the why behind the motivation? And I think you had talked a little bit about, really allowing each student to achieve their full potential. The idea of really educating our students that we have today is something I hear one of your counterpart in West Fargo says, we're educating today's students for tomorrow's world. I don't know if you want to expand on that at all, or if that answers that particular question.
Yes, I echo that. In Oaks, obviously we want our students to reach whatever their full potential is, but we know that it's important that we prepare them for their futures rather than prepare them for what our futures are as adults. And that's a struggle that we have when people say, education was good enough for me 20, 30 years ago. Why is it not good enough for the students today? And my answer is always that we have to prepare them for what their future is, not what ours is, because that's the present time now. And I guess another why for us is that we believe that we should always be in continuous improvement. And so if we're asking our students to continually be improving, we have to do the same thing as a school district and always look for ways to do better and do more with what we have to prepare our students for the future.
That's great. Great. Thank you. So Robin, I think we can talk a little bit about the evaluation now, and we'll keep watching the questions and hold some of them for a later point.
Great. Thank you. So in year 2, KnowledgeWorks brought WestEd in to help them with the evaluation of this initiative, to help them determine, what's going well, what could they be doing better. And go ahead to the next slide, Natalie. This is a texty slide, but I'm going to sum it up and to say that this is about, essentially this is about systemic shifts. And systemic shifts take time. So it is a 5-year project because its systems change. It's also changing hearts and minds. So we're looking at, to what extent are the systems changing? The schools, the districts, the communities, how, and also equity is a big piece of this. How are historically marginalized subgroups experiencing equitable learning outcomes? How are things personalized for them? And Jeff mentioned that one of our sites is the Youth Correctional Center. So there's definitely historically marginalized populations of students there, and thinking about how can we give them more opportunities for their future. And again, as Craig mentioned, it's not just about the academic preparation, but it's the college and career preparedness. So part of that is the career ready skills. It's also the social emotional skills, the communication skills. And then, in improving graduation rates and post-secondary, whether that's college or career and citizenship. So that's a lot to look at. And as I mentioned, you can go ahead to the next slide, Natalie. We completed year 1 of the evaluation. So how did we study this? We visited North Dakota until COVID hit. So we did site visits to 73 classrooms across the 4 districts. We held focus groups and interviews with lots of folks in the community, including parents and staff, cafeteria staff, and custodial staff, teachers, and students, of course. And we also participated in KnowledgeWorks cohort convenings. So we had 3 in-person 2-day convenings. I got to go in October before it got really cold, and my colleagues went in December and February, and then May was virtual. So part of that process was to sit with the districts in their action planning and help them think through, what does action planning look like? Rather than just being a piece of paper you hand in, what are the steps? Who's taking on what to make sure that we're moving this forward and we'll be able to see results. So I'm going to share with you some of the takeaways that we have. Natalie can go ahead to the next slide. Oops. Great. So these are just the big picture takeaways, but we found that the superintendents really had a clear vision for PCBL. It was challenging. While most of the educators were on board, it was challenging for them to really understand, what does this look and feel like when it's going well? And they really wanted to see examples. So later on in one of the quotes, we'll share that they did see some examples by visiting another district in California. Parents, there was some of that question that Craig brought up, like, why are we doing this? My education worked for me. Why can't this work for my kids? There was variable understanding and support for PCBL among parents. I think some of them felt like it was an opportunity for acceleration, but it's more than that. Others were a little concerned about how it would translate to college applications and scholarships. If there's not an A or a B, how are they going to know what my student understood? The parents that we met with were really interested in this and really excited to be a part of it, even though they had some hesitations and some questions. And then the students tended to think about personalization as a path to acceleration. I'm reading at a 5th grade level, so now I'm going to be able to move forward. So there was still some work to do, I think, in people's understanding of what PCBL is and what it can look like in their communities. To illustrate that, I'd love to share a few quotes, so you can move on to the next slide. These are some student quotes, and these are both from Oaks. So Craig mentioned the flex mod schedule, and that the transition to that was challenging. And the students, I remember high school students saying, this just seemed crazy at first, but I would never go back to a bell schedule. And if you don't know what flex mod is, I'm not going to get it perfectly right, because I wasn't in school and I wasn't teaching when they had it, but from what we saw in Oaks, at least, it's the opportunity to be flexible with the schedule. So if a student finishes what they need to do, they can leave 20 minutes early and go home and work on the farm, or they can go see their math teacher because they had some trouble with last night's homework. So it's a more flexible schedule, because we all know that life isn't broken up into 45-minute subjects. That's just not how life works. So this is an opportunity to add some flexibility so kids can get what they need in a personalized way. And I loved the other quote: people can go home and work on the farm during the last hour of school, or you can job shadow, or you can see a teacher. So again, this is a farming community. So this is something that kids are gonna need to do, and the schedule allows them to be able to do that. We also have some quotes from administrators and educators, and you can go ahead, Natalie, and advance. In the group of staff, in one of the focus groups, there was a cafeteria staff and a custodian, and they both said they noticed a lot more respect. Kids cleaning up, kids saying please and thank you. Now, I don't know if that's attributable necessarily to PCBL, but it was an interesting shift to take note of. And Lindsay, California is a place that's been doing this for a long time and is known for doing it really well. And so some of the districts, through a separate grant, were able to travel to Lindsay and see what it looked like. And this quote illustrates that folks realized they had to shift the mindset of kids and of themselves. I think to a growth mindset, and also to thinking about shifting to what does this kid need and what does each and every kid need in my classroom, rather than what is the curriculum telling me I need to deliver. You can go ahead to the next one. Some takeaways. I didn't want more text, so I have a couple of images of the takeaways. think these are both December, but the first picture is students. So there's a student panel that came and talked about what this was like for them. And one of our learnings, which is essential and central to personalized learning, is that student voice is important. It's really important to this, and having them be part of the initiative and part of the conversation is key to continuous improvement. The other takeaway from the convenings was that networking is highly valued, both within and among districts. If you've ever worked in a school, you know you don't have a lot of extra time to meet with your colleagues because you spend most of your day in front of students. So this gave them an opportunity to really roll up their sleeves and think and talk and ask some of those difficult questions and work through the action planning, as well as to meet with other districts in the state and hear about how they're doing things. And while some of the districts are really different from one another, I think that there was something to be learned from all the other districts. I think everyone would say that. So we're gonna go to the pause baby, the pause slide. And I'm gonna pause to see if there are any questions about the evaluation itself and our work with KnowledgeWorks.
There is a question in the chat about how we might be tracking outcomes and whether we're tracking them according to the pedagogical approach. And I would say you're previewing a little bit sort of where we're getting at. If it's all right, I'll take this question, Robin. But right now we've really been focused on sort of the process evaluation and the schools meeting their planning goals and the initial implementation goals. Looking at student outcomes is really something that we're going to do a little bit later, and we're hoping to look at outcomes, not just academic outcomes, but also some of the broader whole child outcomes, the kinds of things that Craig alluded to in his portrait of a graduate, because we don't just care about whether students are getting A's or B's or grades. And so it's definitely a little bit of a challenge, and one we'd love to engage with other people in thinking about how they're doing that. So that's just something that's coming up. We don't have a lot of details yet, but hopefully we'll be invited back to share that once we have all of that. And then just as an aside, as I see that we have a couple of other questions, I just wanted to share that I put a couple of links in the chat so you can learn a little bit more about the work that Craig and his colleagues are doing across the different districts and about the initiative overall. They might be some good, helpful pieces of information and additional context for you, because I know we have just a short time here today. All right, so Robin, I don't know if you want to turn it over to, well, I'll leave it to you to
We're going to volley back to Craig. Craig's going to talk a bit more about the work in Oaks. Next slide, Natalie.
Thank you, Robin. So this slide is 3 different cogs, and it really shows what we've done in terms of utilizing the fall visit information report, our empathic conversations, and then action planning. But initially, when we received our fall visit findings from WestEd, the principals and I reviewed the feedback and met to discuss it. And to be quite honest with you, we had to take a deep breath and say, whew, we thought we might be better than that. Or this is sort of a struggle to see that we need, a lot of improvement in this area. But as we continued to talk and discuss, we said, this is important for us to have the growth mindset, to have continuous improvement. And ultimately, we need to know where we need to have areas of improvement. Otherwise, we wouldn't need to be partnering with 4 other schools and doing a cohort, because we'd already be fully implementing a personalized learning model. And so we had to get over that hump. And then we met with all of our staff and went through the findings and really focused and said that we're going to utilize these findings to help us grow and model a growth mindset and model continuous improvement. And we reminded the staff, these findings are not a got you. They're simply a way for improving opportunities in our progress in PCBL. We cannot expect to be perfect. I told my staff that I don't expect perfection. It doesn't exist in this world. We strive for excellence. And like I said before, if everything were perfect, we wouldn't need to have teamwork and a cohort to be going through this process. And so we utilized that information. We also had our fellows do empathic conversations. In our empathic conversations, the fellows met with teachers in a neutral environment, and they really just asked questions about what's going well with PCBL and what needs improvement with PCBL. And so from the results of those two pieces of data, we then came up with action planning and how we were going to action plan to get us as a district to the next level. So if you could switch to the next slide, please. For 2021, our action planning committees are these 5, and they're learning environments, agency, growth mindset, our portrait for graduate, and then learning progressions and pathways. And so what we've done is that we've broken down our staff so there are paraprofessionals, there are teachers, and there are administrators, and they're in each one of these, they're assigned to each one of these committees, and each one of the committees is going to be the local expert on each one of these areas. And then they have created action plans, and we're going to utilize our 12 early outs. So 12 times a year, we end school an hour early and we do professional development. And we're going to have our very own staff train the rest of our staff on these 5 areas, and they got to pick which one of the 12 they wanted to do that. So we're also changing as a district. Instead of information coming from the top down or coming from some expert that's from outside the district, it's actually our own staff that are doing the training and getting the movement and the lift for the rest of our staff. And I think that's going to be huge for us making progress this year due to it's teachers helping teachers and administrators helping administrators. I believe the next slide, I'm going to turn it over to Drake, and he's going to talk about action planning.
Yeah, thank you, Craig. Hi again, Drake Bryan. I'm Director of Continuous Improvement at KnowledgeWorks. And you know, if there's one thing to be said about this work, it's that scaling PCBL is hard work. I'm sure Craig can attest to that. It's hard work, and we believe that really without the use of data, it almost becomes an impossible task. You know, we feel like this data is necessary for you know the understanding of where are we in this process, and are we achieving our goals, or what can we do better or do differently. And that's really, you know, that's really what we're trying to do here with this data. And you've heard the term action plan been thrown around a few times now. And really what an action plan is, it's a detailed description of the work actually occurring in districts, you know, related to the scaling of PCBL. And typically action plans have a PCBL topic, action steps, indicators, or short or long-term goals, responsible party, and a status. And really this is the foundation for our continuous improvement efforts. And so each district has an action plan of their own. They all look very different, but they all have this understanding of this is what we want to accomplish in this school year. And now it's really up to KnowledgeWorks and WestEd to help provide them data to help them understand where they're at in this movement. And we hope to make this data available to them in a way that they can digest easily and make improvements based on that. Next slide, please. So this little graph here is really, we're hoping to explain how this becomes reality in our districts. And so these districts set goals, strategies, and what we do is we have aligned those goals with our system level drivers, which are really what are the conditions that we feel are necessary for the scaling of PCBL. And you know, those would include culture, you know, aspects of culture, you know, curriculum, etc. And KnowledgeWorks has clearly defined the conditions that we believe are necessary for this type of scaling. So we've aligned each goal to a driver, and then we report data specifically on those goals and drivers. And we hope that this data collection really initiates this continuous improvement process to really help shape the way the work looks and feels on the ground. Next slide, please. So what you see here is an example of, this is from Oaks action planning process. And this is what we tried to create was a template for, again, reporting data in a way that that Craig and that individuals at Oaks can really utilize this data in a meaningful way. So what we've done is we've taken a goal, and this goal is around agency, fostering this sense of agency, and the related action steps that correspond to this goal. And you'll see on the left-hand side, they all relate to the driver, certain drivers that we've added there. And again, it's to create a space and a platform for us to insert data from our formative evaluation, so site visits, surveys, walkthroughs, interviews, focus groups. And we hope that this is a tool that districts can really utilize to see, okay, how are we making progress on our goal, or how are we making steps that are relevant to moving the needle, or are we not seeing progress, and what changes do we need to make? Next slide, please. And so this is really, again, you know, the bottom line is, how do we use this data to show progress, to understand our progress against goals? Are the action steps appropriate? How can we adjust them? And I think another idea is, or another way we're using this data is, how can we refine the way that we are collecting data on the ground through WestEd? How can we do a better job of representing what is actually happening in districts? And you know, these are things that we're thinking about in our our mechanisms for really driving this work forward in a meaningful way. With that, I think I'll turn it back over to Robin.
So I want to add that before we jump into the discussion, it's fine to put this slide up, but in terms of the action planning, Drake mentioned that they all look different, and Craig mentioned that there are five groups, and they have 5 action plans. So when we got all the action plans and opened them up to look at them, you know, I looked at Oaks, and I was trying to review them, and I was trying to compare them in, you know, a matrix. And it was difficult because they don't all look the same. It's, you know, it wasn't necessarily apples to apples. I mean, it's the same important elements that they're looking at. And we had a discussion about that. Do we want to ask the districts to use the same format and use the same template? And to his credit, Drake pushed back and said, we really want them to be able to use the template and the format that works for them. And I think that speaks to the personalization piece, right? And we have to walk what we talk and allow the districts to do what works for them. So that's, again, a piece of this continuous improvement process and a piece of the partnership working with KnowledgeWorks and with the districts to help them use the process that best works for them. And then we have to figure out how to take that data and, you know, give it back in some meaningful way. So with that, I'd love to open it up to discussion, and I'd love to hear some other voices. I see there's a question in the chat, but if somebody wants to put themselves on camera and or on speaker and ask a question, we'd love to hear where you are and what your context is and what your question is.
So maybe as folks are unmuting themselves, I can talk a little bit about Susan's question, which was around describing some of the things that you aim to see in what students were doing or what teachers were doing. And maybe I could add a little bit of context where KnowledgeWorks has a framework for the systems change at the district level. So there's sort of these broad categories of like, there are shifts in culture, there should be shifts or clarity around vision, around practices for transparency, around curricular practices, instructional assessment practices. And it's really a framework because, as Robin said, the idea is really that districts will approach this and personalize it to their needs. But as we were doing the evaluation, some of the things that we would be looking for example, are evidence of student agency in the classroom. So do students have some choices about how they might be doing things? So I remember being in some elementary classrooms, early elementary classrooms, and teachers were working on telling time. And they might sit with the students might sit with the teacher for a very brief lesson, and then the teacher I saw, for example, was explaining some choices they had to then go and learn it in different ways. They could do it by playing a game. They could use it by working with somebody, playing a game with somebody else. They could do it through more of a hands-on activity or a technology-based activity. So even at the youngest ages, we're looking for places where students can have some choices, where students can talk about what they maybe want to do next, and other examples might be where teachers were able to articulate how they are tracking students' progress towards competency or standards, and not simply giving letters on grades that they can't then explain maybe why this is a B. It's got to be tied to the standards or tied to the competencies that they're trying to have students reach. So those are just a few examples of some of the things we might look for. So we did have a classroom observation protocol that when we did the 70+ observations that Robin talked about, we really organized it according to the framework. And I'll see if I can get the link and put it in the chat for you so you can look at that framework. But we're looking at, how are students assessed? Do they have some say in whether they're ready to be assessed in something in particular that they were a competency or standard that they were working towards? So that's very much at the student or teacher level. Hopefully that helps a little bit to bring some focus to what we admittedly have been talking about at a pretty high level.
And how do they share what they know, and how do they get better at what they know? So if they take a test or do a project and they're evaluated on the rubric lower than they may have hoped, what opportunities do they have to show that they learned it and they learned from their mistakes, rather than just, you got a 81 on the algebra quiz and the rest of the 20%, you're not worried about it because it's a B, but really we're concerned about what the students are learning and have they reached the competencies in that algebra course. I see Elliot's question, and Natalie, maybe you can take that. I'll say that obviously what we've mentioned so far has focused on the formative assessment, and we are gearing up for a summative assessment later on, and I'll let Natalie talk a little bit more about that.
Sure, yes. And just one more thing around sort of what we might be looking for is not just whether students have choices, but also whether students can articulate their choices and why they're doing something. Like Robin said, like, it was really interesting to hear students say things like, well, I got a B, so I want to really focus on the things that I didn't get. Being the parent of another high schooler who is not accessing personalized competency-based learning, he's pretty happy with his B's despite his parents' questions about what he might not have learned. But yes, for Elliot's question around sort of the span of the 5-year evaluation, we really did start very much with the process evaluation, the formative implementation. Are the schools and districts working towards developing their action plans? How are they doing it? Are they involving the community? Are they able to communicate their vision? Are they being transparent with all the stakeholders in their education community? So really focusing on those pieces of the process. And as we move into year 3 of the evaluation and project, we're really going to be starting to look at student outcomes and tracking students. And we're actually hoping and planning to put together a quasi-experimental design. North Dakota, for those researchers out there, we're pretty lucky. They have a pretty robust state longitudinal data system and have integrated that data system with data from other agencies, for example, with the post-secondary and workforce. And the plan is to be able to look at outcomes for students, not just in the short term, but also in the long term. So yes, starting with, do students seem to graduate more? Are they graduating more on time? Or are students who maybe were not as likely to graduate, are we seeing increased graduation for those students? And then looking at enrollment in post-secondary options broadly, as well as going into career and post-secondary options. So it really is looking at a long range. And so there's still some details to be worked out around looking at outcomes at different grade levels, because if students have been exposed for 3 years versus 4 years of personalized competency-based learning, will expect to see different kinds of outcomes. So some of that's still to be in play, but we hope to be able to share more of that with you through this platform and others. I should also note that Jeff put in the district conditions, the framework that I was talking about, a link to that in the chat, so you should be able to see that.
Are there other questions or thoughts or feedback?
Could I make a comment on, Susan has a question trying to bring into focus what this looks like for students and for teachers, and I think that's a great question. And although it's, I don't want to sound like we're looking to the past, I think there are a lot of similarities to what we heard about in one-room schoolhouses. For example, when my grandmother taught in the 1920s and 30s, I know that when she taught, if you walked into her classroom, she had grade levels from first grade all the way through 8th, and they were not all working on the same content at the same time. And there were kids that were helping other kids with their content when they knew it and could help. I think there are similarities, and I see similarities to that when we walk into the classroom, it's not like when I was teaching years ago and we were all doing the same thing and we all went along exactly the same time and we covered the content exactly the same way. So I hope that kind of helps put into perspective of how it looks differently and a correlation, I guess, to one-room instruction, one-room schoolhouse instruction from many decades ago.
And there's no question it's a lot of work, and it's work for teachers, and if they work in Oaks and in the North Dakota districts, the teachers are really working together. As you saw, they have a whole system and action planning process and people involved in thinking about what does this look like and what does it mean, and mistakes get made and then learning happens from those mistakes, and it is, it's really knowing your students and having a relationship with your students. As we all know, that's key and central. Understanding what they like and helping them navigate towards that, and tying the learning to that. And that looks different, and it looks different in the different districts. And I think as people get more comfortable with it, they let go a little bit of the control that that is more comfortable for many teachers.
And Christiane asked a little bit about technology, and I won't go too much into technology, but technology is something that I think the districts are leveraging to help teachers manage. Some of the districts, for example, use a learning management system, which can really help the teachers manage students being at different places in a way that facilitates it. It's a snapshot, and also lets the student have some agency and ownership and a way to communicate both with their teacher, but also with their parents. Because I know in a number of the schools, they're really involving parents and families to be more actively involved in their students' education and where they are. And so technology is used differently across the 4 different districts that are participating. I'm just scrolling to see if we have any other.
I will, if you want to jump to the next slide, I will just add that the technology piece has been relevant here. So this is my daughter and her friend on the first day of 6th grade with their masks ready to get on the bus. And so we all know this is a new normal. And it was interesting to pivot and think about how we would gather data differently in the context of COVID, and also to talk with the districts about how many of them felt more prepared than districts who hadn't been in this kind of initiative, because they'd been thinking differently about learning already, and they'd been thinking about personalization already, and some had been using technology already. So it was a much quicker shift to robust learning than, you know, in other places like my own district, where it was okay, but it wasn't robust learning in April and May. So I think we can wrap there. I know that Elliot wants to have a chance for folks to fill out a survey, but I think we have another minute or two for any other questions that anyone may have.
And Elliot, feel free to start the wrap up that you needed to do. I think you have a wrap up slide and survey, and I'll monitor the chat to see if any questions come up in the meantime.
You can skip
Emily,
ahead.
do you want to advance to there?
There you go.
Great. All right. Well, do you have other questions coming in, Robin? I'm trying to see here.
I don't
no,
see
not
any
at the
at this
moment.
point.
Great. Craig, that one-room schoolhouse analogy also really brought to mind for me. I visited the Chugach School District last year, which has a number of small schools that are very involved in competency-based, and it really does have that one-room schoolhouse feel. So that really is a great analogy for what this can look like in large or small buildings, really. But thank you very much to all of the presenters. It's been really valuable to hear about all of your work in North Dakota. We appreciate all the insights from your work that can help us move ahead, both on the practice front and the research front in advancing personalized competency-based education. So thanks so much. And we're really looking forward to hearing how your cohort and North Dakota transform over time. So it's just exciting to hear how much effort you all are putting into this work in Oaks and in North Dakota more broadly. We also appreciate everyone who attended today and all of your participation and active involvement in the chat box and the polls. It would be really helpful to us if you could click on the survey link, which is now in the chat box. It's just 3 questions. If you could take a minute to complete it, that would be very helpful for us. I'm just going to pause for about 10 seconds so you can shift your attention over to that link. And then I'll just get started again. Great, and while they're doing that, could I have the next slide, please? So while you're finishing up the survey, I want to share more information about our webinar series. This is, as I mentioned earlier, part of a series that we're doing from August through November, beginning and before and ending after our symposium. And these are 10 webinars that are coming up soon, and you can find detailed descriptions of these and register on our website. And I believe, yep, that webinar series is also in the chat box now. And could I have the next slide, please? Great. So, and our Aurora Institute Symposium, which is usually an in-person event, this year is going to be virtual, October 26th through 28th. We have some amazing speakers lined up and activities, some social events. And so we hope you'll join us and visit our website for more information on that. And that link is also in the chat box. Next slide, please. Finally, we invite you to stay connected with us at the Aurora Institute. And please join me again in thanking our presenters for their terrific presentation today. Really, everyone, we greatly appreciate all that you taught us and all that you shared, and we wish you well. We look forward to seeing everyone again soon. And that's all. Take care, everyone.